Hello and welcome to the summer edition of Politics at Sam and Anne's. We're doing our traditional summer once a week deep dive into one particular subject. This week, is Westminster remotely prepared for the AI revolution? My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Given the potential of generative AI to change the way we live, the way we work, in some ways even the way we think, it seems as if our present Prime Minister isn't entirely sure if it's a good thing or not.
AI might be able to write an essay, draft a contract, or make a slide deck, but it can't make a train like they do here, rewire your electrics, or fix your roof.
And the thing is, if you ask AI, and we did, AI does think it can build a train, and even if it can't bolt together those metal sheets and turn the screws, it could certainly change the way that a train is designed and operated, and innovation about then how it's used most efficiently. So is this a case of Andy Burnham going a bit Hovis, like that old advert, and looking nostalgically to the past when AI is really all of our futures?
Because we don't have a huge amount to go on. But, you know, Anne, you singled out that episode. I've also found something that he did just in his second week as Prime Minister on the Jimmy's Jobs podcast that just tells you a little bit about his instincts when it comes to tech and AI. He leans into protecting jobs in the existing industries, into talking to unions about the way that the workforce might change shape in the years to come. Less of that mainlining AI that we heard about in the Starmer era. It feels like we could be on the cusp of quite a big shift. Or is Andy Burnham talking bold, but as we've seen in other areas, actually is taking a more cautious approach when it comes to what he actually changes?
And there's a bit of a paradox here, isn't there? Because we do have from this government, as from its predecessor, a national AI strategy. It's foregrounded as something that the UK does want to happen and wants to pursue at pace. And all those things that AI is supposed to be able to do for us, increased resilience, productivity, growth, innovation, these are all things that Andy Burnham also wants to embrace. So it seems like he has choices to make and trade-offs, and that's what we wanted to explore today. And we're really pleased to have with us to do that an expert in the field. It's my colleague Isobel Asher Hamilton. She is tech editor for Politico in the UK and can walk us through all the undergrowth of the AI world. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne Summer Box Set.
Great to be here.
Let's just start, if you could, with where you think Britain stands in the world when it comes to AI, how we're doing as a country. Are we at the front rank? Are we sort of mid-table? Could you give us just a feel for, is this something that Britain does and has the capacity to do well?
So I would say that globally speaking, we're sort of near the top, but there's a big but here. The first two spots are the US and China, and then there's a very, very big gap before you get to anyone else. So the UK does have an awful lot of talent. It does have a lot of startups, and this is something that's pretty hard to replicate in other places. We are quite good at spinning stuff out of our universities and getting really incredible breakthroughs done here. That doesn't necessarily mean that then turns into a company on the scale of anything like OpenAI, Anthropic, or, going back further, Meta, Google. In fact, the sort of biggest thing that came out of here was a company called DeepMind, which was doing AI long before OpenAI made it fancy. And DeepMind were bought by Google. So they still have an office here. They obviously culturally are still quite British, but in reality, they are an American company now. And that is something that we see happening quite a lot. You get a very promising young company starting up here. They're getting a bit bigger. They're getting a bit more noticeable. And then an American company comes and snaps them up. It's a problem that the government has kind of recognised.
Do we even really want to make these big companies in AI? I ask that question because if you'd asked me when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, if we were sitting here, I'd say, of course he does. That's absolutely, he'd love to cut that AI ribbon. But if you ask me about does the government now, we've had a transition from Keir Starmer to Andy Burnham, how seriously do they really take this or see it more as a kind of problem to be solved, as Sam was pointing out when we took us into those early clips of the Prime Minister sounding like he thought it was all a bit of a headache?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, more recently than Rishi Sunak, I think you would have had ministers saying absolutely. I think when Peter Kyle was tech secretary, there was a lot of talk about the first $1 trillion company in the finding the first $1 trillion company in the UK, right? He was then business secretary. Liz Kendall took over, and there's been a changing of the guard since then. There's no longer a Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. But I do think there has been a shift. We have got an AI minister in Kanishka Narayan, and his rhetoric has been quite focused not on building something that looks like an OpenAI or an Anthropic, but on finding like use cases that make sense for Britain, he would say. And he's tapped in quite quickly to the Andy Burnham language around reindustrialization. And he gave his first interview to the FT, where he talked about manufacturing, drones, and not just AI in manufacturing, but he was also making some very hopeful noises around having a manufacturing business here for AI chips, which is very ambitious, I would say.
Has there been any kind of reaction to the change of government, both the language and the kind of rewiring of Whitehall that went with it?
So on the language, I would say that Keir Starmer was already making quite a lot of similar noises around workers. In London Tech Week, which I think was in June, there was like some big announcements around AI and workers and pro-worker AI, and setting up a new AI economics institute that was going to monitor the situation and, recommend interventions as they see fit. So it's not entirely a Burnham phenomenon. In terms of how the industry has reacted, the rewiring of Whitehall was the bigger problem. News of that got out a bit before it happened, and immediately, sort of before it had been officially announced, you saw people from the industry popping off on LinkedIn, on Twitter, saying this is dreadful. Who are we going to talk to now? It's a sign that it's slipping down the agenda, and it shouldn't. And then, once it was officially announced and they started divvying DSIT up, and they are sort of carving it up between the Cabinet Office, DCMS, and a new and improved Business and Trade Department. So once that had kind of happened, they set up a call with lots of industry people. I think it was about 100 industry people, between them, Kanishka Narayan, who's AI minister, and Johnny Reynolds, who is head of BIST now, as it's called.
Business,
Innovation, Science and
Trade.
Trade.
And lots of other bits.
Yeah. Simply the BIST, as we call it in the office. And so they got on a call with all of these industry folks and said, look, this is good news. You're going to have a bigger department going to bat for you. You're going to have 2 ministers at the cabinet table who are going to be on your side. So really, it's all good news. I don't think that, I don't think the tech industry necessarily took that at face value. It's just a pain when you have to rebuild all your relationships and you're used to having like one front door you can walk through.
Well, let's see how that goes forward in the autumn. Help us understand this, Isobel. We had sort of a period where you could see the US was taking its AI development in a certain direction. It was largely taking the fetters off. That kind of continued a lot in the Trump administration. We've had Europe with endless arguments inside the EU about whether to create an AI identity and regulatory framework that's very separate, and then you have all kinds of arguments about how this is to work together in a globalized setting for AI. There was an idea that the UK could sit somewhere in the middle of this and be important or interpret one side to the other. Is that fanciful, or is this a role perhaps on our good old Greenwich Mean Time is often our friend here, in which we can be an AI power ourselves, even if, as you suggest, we're going to be way behind the pace of change in China or the US?
It's a good question.
You sound like you don't like it.
I think what's difficult about it is a lot of the time you have these different jurisdictions sort of signaling that they're going to take a different, their own approach. There's a lot of talk about sovereignty, and there's not a lot of clarity around what it means. And quite often you kind of get to a point where places like the EU, UK, US, they're all kind of settling on what their identity is going to be in terms of AI regulation. And then something hits the headlines like, an OpenAI agent has hacked another company autonomously, and everyone's got to scramble and decide, are we going to rethink this? And with the Trump administration in particular, we've really seen a lot of like whipsaw, it's all going to be laissez-faire because we want our companies to be advancing way faster than China's. Actually, no, we want to have a lot tighter control over this. And then Sam Altman will get to Capitol Hill and then it'll all change again. So I find it difficult to kind of place where we're going to be, especially when a lot of it realistically just is happening in the US, because that's where these companies are based. And when there's a change like that, it comes from inside the industry. It doesn't come from like a regulation. We are still definitely signaling that we're not going to be like the EU and we're not going to be quite as constraining. That's something that Liz Kendall, who's now out as tech secretary, was signaling not so long ago. I suppose that could change under Burnham, but I don't see why it would necessarily.
One of the sort of great indicators of the last couple of years was a sort of battle inside the Labour Party over AI and copyright. So the Keir Starmer government came in and pretty early on said that it was looking at changing what AI big learning models can basically use when they're operating and what they can scrape, and that their preferred option was that unless you'd opted out of something, you should assume that your material was sucked into the LLMs. Now, that caused a huge backlash, motivating almost everybody on the sort of creative sector from Elton John, Labour Donut downwards. And they've wound their neck in on that a bit. But where do we end up with that? And how's that all shaken down? And did that harm Britain, or is there still quite a lot to play for?
The government initially outlined the opt-out as their preferred option, which is kind of what kicked this all off. And yeah, as you said, creative industry got pretty aggy about it, understandably so. And my memory as well is that the tech companies also weren't super happy about it. They kind of managed to please no one. And now we're sort of waiting to see what their next moves are on copyright. And because DCIT's been disbanded and it's been scattered to different parts of the government, that part of the work is going to fall to DCMS and to Lisa Nandy, who had been doing work on this before. She came in to that sort of work, and she's been pretty strong in support for creatives. But
so the ball's back in the Burnham government's court, and they've handed it to one of the more conservative figures on this debate.
Yeah, I would say so, but there's still, I still wouldn't want to say that she's going to go one way or the other. One thing that they've been tussling over is whether or not to provide this exemption that would mean you could mine stuff if it was for research purposes. And the creative industry hates that because they say, well, that's going to be a very exploitable loophole. I think what some people in the tech industry would also say is, even if you bring in really strict copyright guards here, it's not like British material isn't accessible in other jurisdictions. So you're not really, it's performative, basically, is what they would say. But yes, it's back in the government's court, and they're going to have to figure out what they think at some point.
And what about the kind of British NIMBYism disease as a problem here? Because it's interesting that you said at the beginning that Andy Burnham was trying to marry his reindustrialisation strategy, or rather the new AI minister has been clearly singing from the same song sheet. But a couple of things. One is then things like data centre building. That you could say, well, that's part of a big reindustrialisation push, but the industries of the future, AI and tech-driven, rely on that. But that's really tricky. People don't seem to want them next door in the way that they didn't used to want big old refuse dumps next door. They just don't like these huge things next to them. And the other thing is, of course, industrial electricity prices are so high in the UK. So do you think the Burnham government's going to face a moment when it's not just, if you like, we've talked a lot about the sector, but it's actually his own promise to bring new industries to life are going to mean some quite difficult policy choices linked to the development of AI in the UK?
So with data centres specifically, there's this policy that comes from the Starmer government, which is for AI growth zones, which are meant to be these sort of areas that government can designate where it's easier to build a data centre, it's easier to set up these kind of clusters. They've been struggling a lot. industry's main complaint is that they don't do anything to address the more fundamental challenges. And the big one, like you said, is electricity. And not just energy prices, but grid hookups. This week, we saw Ofgem, the energy regulator, bring in this new proposal that they're going to make data centres basically put down a deposit to actually get in the queue for grid connection. And the reason for that is that they've seen so many applications from data centre projects, and they think loads of them are speculative, which could, really gum up our grid connection queue in general. So they're saying, look, you've got to put down a fee, and if the project goes ahead, great, you get it back, and if it doesn't, then we're keeping it. So there are broader problems to do with this, industrial push. And then also with data centers, it's not just in the UK that we see this, but with data centers, quite often the promise is they're going to bring jobs. And then we've seen in a few different places in the world that they don't bring that many jobs. And that can cause quite a lot of friction with local communities. And there's also concerns about, energy usage, water usage. There's droughts at the moment when we're recording this. So these are things that people get very anxious about when it's in their backyard.
Another of those political issues around AI it's become quite talismanic for the Labour Party is Palantir. There are wings of the Labour Party that would like it to be completely sort of slung out of the NHS and for the break clause in the contract that the NHS has with Palantir over its data analysis to be activated. That'll actually be one of the big decisions for Andy Burnham this autumn. And we've seen France, for instance, move away from Palantir and trying to build a bit of homegrown capacity. If the Burnham government decides to sort of, as it were, press the nuclear button on Palantir and take it out of the NHS, what impact do you think that would have on the sector?
I think there'd be lots of very excitable companies bidding to replace it. It would be the answer to that. So there's a few companies here in the UK that present themselves as lovely sovereign alternatives to Palantir. And there was one that told us that Palantir kind of opened the door to companies like that. It's not the only company that can do that kind of tech. Also, it might be a case of, officials kind of combing through and looking, actually, is there something we could get for cheaper?
Is that really, Palantir is in itself such a huge topic, so I suppose there's going to be a bit of a nutshell question to you, but a lot of people would like to advocate, often for political reasons, to take it out of the NHS, but it is in so many trusts already. I think it's in sort of way north of 100 hospital trusts. So even if you did want to take it out, you would have a lot of disruption. We've got Yvette Cooper, new health secretary. We don't know what view she's going to take. Is it really as easy as it sounds to swap one supplier in and one supplier out when then the other company has the proprietary data on some contract that is probably a little hard for us to understand from the outside?
So there's two things to say about that. One is that we've seen reports that although it is in a lot of trusts, it's not necessarily being used that often. And the other thing to say is that in a lot of trusts, they're already struggling with pretty simple software. They're struggling just getting their computers to work. And they would say, okay, we can think about AI, we can think about all this very exciting new technology, but can we maybe just get the computers off Windows 95 or something like that? There's still places where they're having to resort to pen and paper. So there is a sort of argument that goes, you need to have a more fundamental think and not get kind of fixated on Palantir, if that makes sense.
And I'm interested in whether or not Britain's developing a little bit of a reputation globally when it comes to the implications for what happened with social media as well. We saw the moves at the very end of the Keir Starmer regime to introduce a form of ban on under-16s using social media. What's been the reaction to that? Are we simply going in the same direction as, first of all, Australia, more recently France?
So with social media bans specifically, I think we are moving with a tide. I think we've seen it start in Australia and it's gone around the world. Canada as well, the EU is thinking about it, France, like you mentioned. I'm not sure exactly where we're going to end up falling. At the moment, there's kind of two models. There's the Australian one and the Canadian one. And the Canadian model sort of has not quite a workaround, but it says to companies, if you can prove that you're safe, then you're exempt from this ban. that's maybe a simplistic term for it, but if you can prove you're safe, then we can let kids on there. So it's possible that we could end up going for something like that, but we really don't have the details. This thing was announced right at the tail end of Keir Starmer's career as Prime Minister, and it didn't even have a definition of what they count as social media in it. It had a list of companies, all the ones you would expect to see come with the announcement, but the details really matter here. What do they count as social media? We've seen all these companies going to great pains to explain how they are not social media. Places like TikTok and YouTube, they would say, well, we are on a content graph, not a social graph. It's not really about chatting to your mates so much as watching, sketches and educational videos and all these things. It's not really social in the way that people used to think about social media. So how they define social media is going to be a really big question that's going to be right at the top when they come back in the autumn.
Anything else you're looking to as we prepare for the autumn of worst? We're swatting up. Where do you think the government will be landing in the argument on AI? Andy Burnham gets in his stride.
Yeah, I think I'll be watching the language. I think that a big feature of Starmer was having this AI opportunities action plan that got put together by this entrepreneur, Matt Clifford, and he came out and said we were going to mainline AI as a nation, which is an incredible choice of language for a prime minister to make. I don't think Burnham's going to talk like that.
I can't imagine that.
No. I don't think that necessarily means that the policies will undergo radical changes, though. I will be interested to watch. There's an AI task force that's been set up in Number 10 specifically, and it's being chaired by Patrick Vallance, who set up the COVID vaccine task force. So I'll be really interested to see what they do and how they interact with the rest of government, because they'll be going up, I think, through the Cabinet Office straight to the PM. So they'll have a fairly direct line, about as close to a main line as we can expect.
It could change everything. Peter Cole thought it might change everything in the course of just this Parliament, or if Andy Burnham gets it away, maybe a little bit more incremental. We will find out through the autumn and beyond. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Isobel.